Who would ever believe that, in the deadliest blizzard Wyoming had seen in 20 years, a lost little girl's only hope would come from a wild predator, a bobcat? Against all odds and every rule of nature, a solitary hunter turned into an unlikely guardian angel, braving the storm to save a shivering child lost in the woods. If you want to hear more true stories that prove miracles don't always play by the rules, subscribe to my channel and join me on journeys where the wild and wonder meet. No one who lived near South Pass, Wyoming, would ever forget that storm. The locals would say it rolled in like a living thing, swallowing the horizon in white, erasing the sky and the ground until you couldn't tell where the world ended and the nightmare began. It was the worst blizzard in 2 decades, and to Emily Carter, who had driven over a dozen Rocky Mountain winters, it looked like nothing short of the end of the world. Emily was a nurse, steady and practical, but even she felt a tremor of fear as she peered through the windshield. Her little Subaru seemed so small out here, fighting its way across the high, lonely pass. The snow battered the car with sideways gusts, wind howling so loud it seemed to shake the metal itself. Headlights barely reached past the swirling white, and the road, the only fragile line between civilization and wilderness, was vanishing beneath the onslaught. Her daughter Sophie, just 4 years old, sat in her booster seat clutching a battered old teddy bear. Sophie's voice piped up from the back, bright and innocent. "Are we almost home, Mommy?" Emily forced a smile she didn't feel, keeping her eyes on the fleeting trace of road. "Almost, sweetheart. Just a little while longer." But she could feel the tension rising, creeping up the back of her neck. The weather report had warned about this, but she'd needed to get home. Her shift at the hospital had run late. Too many emergencies, a shortage of staff. She'd bundled Sophie in the car, telling herself she'd take it slow, that they'd be fine. Now, looking out at the nightmarish white world, Emily wasn't so sure. Visibility dropped to nothing. A sudden gust rocked the car. The steering wheel felt slippery under her gloved hands, and Emily's heart pounded as she eased her foot off the gas. "Hold on, honey," she whispered, more to herself than to Sophie. A shape loomed out of the blizzard, a road sign, half buried, warning of a curve. Emily tapped the brakes, but the tires lost grip on the icy road. For one suspended moment, everything was silence and slow motion. Then the car skidded sideways, tires shrieking, metal grinding against packed snow. Sophie screamed. Emily's hands wrenched at the wheel, fighting for control. The world spun, a wall of white, headlights whirling. Then, with a bone-jarring crunch, the Subaru slid off the edge of the highway and into a shallow gully, slamming to a stop against a drift. For a few seconds, all Emily heard was the groan of the wind and Sophie's terrified sobs. Emily tried to move, but something was wrong. Her head swam, the world tipping and spinning. It's okay, she slurred, not sure if she was talking to Sophie or herself, but everything hurt. Something warm trickled down her forehead. She tried to reach for her daughter, but darkness crowded in at the edges of her vision. She heard Sophie calling, crying, but her voice sounded far away, muffled by the wind and the snow that pressed against the doors and windows. Emily tried to fight the darkness, to stay awake for her little girl, but exhaustion dragged her under. Her last thought before everything went black was Sophie, her sweet face, her small hands reaching out in the chaos. Time passed, measured only by the rising scream of the blizzard. The wind battered the wrecked car, snow piling higher against the doors. The world outside was a white, merciless void. Inside, Sophie's sobs quieted to hiccuping breaths. She clung to her teddy bear, her small body bruised and shivering. "Mommy," she whimpered. No answer. "Mommy." Still nothing. Emily lay slumped in the front seat, blood crusted in her hair. Sophie pushed at her car seat straps, fumbling with numb fingers. The cold bit through her coat and mittens. She didn't understand what had happened, only that the world was suddenly wrong, and her mother wouldn't wake up. Outside, the wind shrieked. The windows frosted over, blocking out the little light that remained. Sophie called for help, her voice tiny in the roaring dark. But no one heard. Somewhere in the tumble of the wreck, her teddy bear slipped from her grip and disappeared beneath the seat. Minutes stretched to hours. The cold grew sharper, crueler, creeping into her bones. Sophie's teeth chattered as she stared at her mother's unmoving face, willing her to wake up. Finally, something changed. The snow pressing against the door cracked open, a tiny gap letting in a blast of freezing wind. Sophie, desperate and shaking, wriggled free from her car seat. She crawled toward the crack, her boots slipping on the icy floor. Her little fingers fumbled for the handle. The door, heavy with snow, creaked open just wide enough for her to squeeze through. The blizzard swallowed her instantly. She stood alone, the car a half-buried lump behind her, the world nothing but endless white. She turned in circles, calling for her mother, for anyone. The storm tore the words from her mouth. The snow swallowed her footprints almost as soon as she made them. When rescue seemed impossible, when hope was as thin as the wind itself, Sophie took her first steps into the wild. Somewhere, in the storm beyond sight, something moved, a silent shape, watching, waiting. The snow hit Sophie like a living thing, stinging her face and forcing her to squint. The world outside the wrecked car was nothing like the safe, warm place she remembered. Now everything was cold, blinding white and noise, the shriek of the wind, the crunch of snow beneath her little boots, the terrified drumbeat of her own heart. She turned back once, thinking she might crawl back into the car, but the door had slammed shut behind her, and she couldn't budge it. Inside, her mom was still unmoving, a shadow through the frosted glass. Sophie's cheeks burned from the cold. Tears froze as they slipped down her face. "Mommy." Her voice was barely a whisper now, instantly swept away by the roaring wind. She wrapped her arms around herself and stumbled forward, calling for help, for her mom, for anyone. But out here, no one answered. The snow drifted around her knees, and every step grew heavier. It was like the blizzard wanted to swallow her whole, to erase her tiny footprints before she could even leave a mark. She searched for her teddy bear, remembering how it always made her brave. But it was gone, lost somewhere inside the car. That made everything worse. Sophie felt alone in a way she'd never known before, as if she were the only person left in the world. She cried, the sound lost in the storm. Still, something inside her, a flicker of determination, stubborn as her mother's, kept her moving. "Have to help Mommy," she whispered, each word a fragile promise to herself. Her little legs trudged onward, boots barely making tracks before the wind erased them. All she could see were trees in the distance, their dark shapes wavering behind curtains of snow. Maybe someone was there. Maybe someone could help. Sophie wandered toward the pines, the trees looming taller and darker as she approached. She'd never been this far from her mom, never been so alone or so scared. The storm pressed closer, the cold biting deeper. Her mittens soaked through, her fingers went numb. She stumbled, falling face first into the snow. For a moment, she just lay there, wishing the cold would stop, wishing she was home, wishing for her mother's arms. But the fear of leaving her mom alone was stronger. She pushed herself up, sobbing, and kept walking. Somewhere above, the night thickened. Clouds raced across the sky, and the world faded from white to gray to an endless, hopeless darkness. Sophie's energy waned. Her steps slowed. She called for help again, her voice ragged, but there was no answer. Only wind and snow and the distant mournful groan of pine trees swaying in the gale. As she neared the trees, Sophie realized she was getting tired. So tired. Her thoughts grew fuzzy, her limbs heavy. She remembered stories her mom had told her, stories about lost children who wandered away and were never seen again. For the first time, she wondered if she might be one of them. No. Have to help Mommy. But her courage faded as her strength gave out. She stumbled again, nearly toppling headfirst into a drift. When she finally reached the edge of the pines, she sank down at the base of a tree, shivering uncontrollably. She curled up as tight as she could, knees to chest, arms wrapped around herself. The wind found her even here, blowing snow in little stinging waves that settled on her back and hair. She whimpered. Her voice was tiny now, barely more than a whimper lost in the storm. I'm here. Mommy, I'm here. Time lost meaning. Sometimes she closed her eyes and imagined she was back home in her own bed, warm under the blankets, her mom humming in the next room. Other times, she was sure she heard footsteps crunching in the snow. A rescuer, maybe, or just a trick of the wind. Each time she opened her eyes, there was only the storm. Somewhere far away, headlights flickered and died. Helicopters tried to take off, but were forced back by the screaming winds. Searchers bundled in parkas and snow gear trudged through knee-deep drifts, calling Sophie's name, their voices carried away and lost. They found the wrecked car, its windows frosted over, doors sealed tight by snow. Inside, Emily Carter awoke, groggy and bleeding, and when she realized Sophie was gone, she screamed, a sound the wind scattered to nothing. The searchers traced small footprints leading from the car into the trees, but soon even those vanished, covered by fresh snow. No one could follow. Not in this blizzard. Back beneath the pines, Sophie tried to stay awake. She tried to remember her mom's face, her voice, her laugh, but the world kept getting darker, colder, and she couldn't stop shivering. She tucked her chin into her jacket, hugging her knees so tight it hurt. She whispered, "Somebody, help, please." A branch snapped somewhere in the trees. Sophie's head jerked up, her eyes wide. She saw nothing at first. Only the shifting white, the shadows dancing. But she wasn't alone. She felt it. Something was out there, watching, moving quietly through the storm. Was it a person? A rescuer? She tried to call out, but her voice stuck in her throat. The darkness pressed closer. Snow settled on her lashes, blurring her vision. Still, she thought she saw movement. Something low to the ground. Something bigger than a fox, silent as the snow itself. She closed her eyes, exhausted, unable to fight anymore. The last thing she heard was a low, almost comforting growl, and the strange sense that she wasn't quite as alone as she thought. Out there in the wild, the blizzard raged on. But beneath the pines, a child's hope flickered in the cold, refusing to be snuffed out. The blizzard's grip only tightened as the Wyoming sun disappeared behind swollen, iron-gray clouds. With darkness came a deeper cold, sharp and alive, gnawing at the resolve of even the toughest men and women searching the mountains. At the edge of South Pass, Headlights cut across swirling snow, casting eerie shadows that flickered and vanished before the wind could erase them. Inside the wrecked Subaru, Emily Carter's world was a whirl of pain and confusion. She surfaced slowly from the heavy fog of unconsciousness, blinking against the frost-laced glass. Everything hurt. Her arms, her head, her heart most of all. The car was colder than she'd ever known. Every surface rhymed with ice, her breath coming in weak, visible puffs. For a few long moments, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory crashed down with the force of the storm. The spinning car, Sophie's scream, the terrible silence. Panic stabbed through her chest. "Sophie," she croaked, her voice rough with cold and fear. No answer. She twisted around, pain burning through her side, searching the back seat, empty. No sign of her daughter. Only Sophie's pink mitten, lying crumpled on the floor, and her beloved teddy bear trapped under the seat. Emily's hands shook as she fumbled with her seatbelt, nearly sobbing as she forced herself out of the driver's seat and into the back. She clawed at the doors, pounding at the windows, screaming Sophie's name into the endless, howling dark. But the wind answered only with its mournful cry. Outside, night fell fast. The sky vanished, replaced by an unbroken wall of white. In town, word of the accident had already spread. Calls for help went out across radio waves and cell towers. Rescuers, firefighters, sheriff's deputies, volunteers bundled in every coat and scarf they could find, gathered at the small highway patrol outpost. The storm was legendary already, snarling up the passes, closing off roads and grounding the rescue helicopters before they could even warm their rotors. On foot and snowmobile, searchers set out, their flashlights little more than dim halos in the blizzard. They shouted Sophie's name, fighting through waist-high drifts and gusts strong enough to stagger grown men. "Keep going! She's got to be out here!" "We'll find her. Don't let the tracks vanish." But the wind was relentless, greedy. Sophie's tiny boot prints vanished almost as soon as they were made, snow swirling in to fill them up. Teams scoured the highway until they found the Subaru, nearly buried under a mound of drift. They reached Emily first, hauling her out of the car, wrapping her in blankets, asking over and over, "Where's your daughter? Where's Sophie?" Emily, numb with cold and guilt, could only sob, "She's gone. She's gone into the storm. Please, you have to find her." Rescue teams split up, following what little evidence remained. A line of small footprints already half obliterated by the snow led away from the crash and into the trees. Searchers followed, hearts pounding, but the prints quickly disappeared into nothing. Emily was rushed to the local hospital, shaking with shock and grief. She begged the paramedics to turn around, to let her keep searching. "Please, please, I have to find her, I have to." But they held her gently, promising, "We're not giving up, Emily. We'll find your little girl." In the woods, night deepened. The storm changed the world, twisting familiar landmarks into shadows, making the forest strange and unkind. Searchers moved in pairs, calling, listening for any hint of a child's cry. Their flashlights swept across the snow, catching nothing but branches and ice. At the edge of the forest, the rescue effort ground to a near halt. Snowmobiles sputtered, engines choking in the deep drifts. Radios crackled with static. Some searchers knelt, peering at the prints in the snow, whispering to each other about the odds, about what might be out there in the dark. Inside the hospital, Emily lay awake, hands clenched in the stiff sheets. She replayed the moment over and over, Sophie's little voice, her frightened eyes, the way she'd vanished into the storm. Guilt battered her. Why hadn't she locked the doors? Why hadn't she stayed awake? Was her daughter crying, calling for her? A nurse touched her shoulder. "Try to rest, Emily. We're doing everything we can." But Emily could only stare at the ceiling, her mind drifting back and forth between hope and terror. Outside, the search pressed on. Teams moved deeper into the trees, their bodies battered by wind and cold, their flashlights weaker with every hour. "She's out here somewhere," a volunteer insisted, his beard crusted with frost. "I know she is. We just have to keep going." Hours passed, slow and merciless. Some searchers returned, faces drawn and defeated. Others pressed on, refusing to surrender to the storm. They found the place where Sophie's prints disappeared, lost in a swirl of snow and pine needles. Some thought they saw the shape of something larger, a blur of movement at the edge of their lights. But nothing stayed. Nothing answered their calls. As midnight approached, the forest was silent except for the wind. Somewhere in that vast, indifferent wild, a little girl wandered, unseen and unheard. Somewhere, hope flickered, a fragile, stubborn thing, refusing to die. Emily whispered her daughter's name into the dark, into her dreams, into the cold that filled every empty space. She willed the world to give her back, and far away, beneath the tangled pines and falling snow, Sophie's journey, guided by fate, by fear, and by something wild, continued. The night pressed in heavy and cold, swallowing every hint of warmth beneath the tall pines. Sophie lay crumpled at the base of a tree, her little coat hardly enough against the biting wind. She was exhausted, her body numb, eyelids heavy, consciousness drifting like the snow around her. She barely registered her surroundings anymore, just the sharp pain of the cold and the distant memory of her mother's voice, echoing somewhere in the dark. Her breath came in shallow, hitching gasps. The cold crept up her arms, stiffened her fingers. She shivered and whimpered, hugging herself tighter, trying to remember what warmth felt like. All around, the storm still raged, shaking the treetops and sending powdery gusts swirling through the shadows. It was easy to imagine monsters out there, wolves, ghosts, things that only came out when the world was asleep. But as Sophie slipped closer to the edge of sleep, she heard a different sound, a crunch, slow and deliberate, not like the wind or the trees. She opened her eyes a slit, heart thudding. Something was moving through the storm. At first, she thought it was a trick of the wind, but the sound grew louder, closer, more real with every second. Something big, heavier than a fox or rabbit. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Fear fluttered in her chest, weak and helpless. Her mind raced. Was it a bear or a coyote? She whimpered, wishing for her mother, for anyone to find her. Out of the white, a shadow emerged. A creature crouched low, moving with eerie, feline grace. Its coat was pale as the snow, striped with smoky gray. Its green eyes glowed, reflecting every glimmer of moonlight and storm. A wild bobcat, bigger than any house cat, muscles rippling beneath its thick fur, pads silent as ghosts on the powdery snow. Sophie froze, breath caught in her throat. She'd seen pictures in books. Bobcats were wild, dangerous. The adults always said to keep away, that they were hunters, not friends. The animal circled her slowly, tail twitching, massive paws leaving clean prints in the drift. Sophie's pulse hammered. She wanted to cry out, to call for her mother, but no sound came. The bobcat paused, sniffing the air, its nose twitching. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for teeth, for claws, for pain. But the animal only sniffed at her, its breath warm against her cheek. It did not attack. Instead, it sat down beside her, curling its body around her small, shaking frame. Sophie's eyes fluttered open in disbelief. The bobcat's fur was impossibly warm, so much warmer than her coat. Its massive body blocked the worst of the wind, sheltering her. For a long, trembling moment, she simply lay there, not daring to move, heart thumping in her ears. The storm raged on around them, but in that tiny cocoon, the world seemed almost safe. Sophie, desperate for comfort, pressed her cheek against the cat's side. The bobcat's breathing was deep and steady, its presence oddly calming. Sophie whispered, "Kitty." Her voice was faint, barely audible above the storm. The bobcat didn't flinch. It only stretched out farther, curling its tail around Sophie's boots, as if to say, "You're mine now. I'll keep you safe." As the night deepened, Sophie drifted in and out of consciousness, lulled by the steady rise and fall of the animal's breathing. She'd never felt anything like it. The wild warmth, the strange, powerful sense of being watched over. She clung to the moment, letting herself believe that somehow, impossibly, she was protected. Far off, the searchers' shouts were lost in the wind. They had no way of knowing that the child they sought was not alone, that she had found, or been found by, a guardian unlike any other. Inside her mind, Sophie wandered through dreams, her mother's voice calling, the safe glow of their home, her teddy bear waiting for her on the bed. But each time the cold crept in, the bobcat shifted closer, a living shield against the storm. As the hours passed, the blizzard began to lose its fury. The snow fell softer, quieter. The worst of the night was over, but the forest remained deep and deadly cold. Sophie woke with a start. The bobcat was still there, its fur covered in a dusting of frost. The animal licked her cheek gently, its rough tongue warm and reassuring. Sophie giggled weakly, feeling a little less scared. "Kitty, don't go," she murmured, her words slurred with exhaustion. The bobcat blinked at her, eyes golden and ancient. It stretched, yawned, and settled back in place, never letting the cold near her. Somewhere out in the wild, other creatures stirred. A distant howl, maybe a coyote, maybe something else, echoed through the trees. The bobcat's ears twitched, but it didn't move, remaining a steadfast guardian. Dawn threatened on the horizon, a faint pink glow barely visible through the heavy clouds. Sophie could feel hope flickering, tiny but alive. She was not alone in the wilderness. She was not forgotten. The wild cat had chosen her, or maybe she had chosen it. For now, that was all that mattered. She let herself relax, pressing closer to the animal's side, feeling its heartbeat, its strength. The blizzard might rage and the world might forget her, but in that moment, Sophie belonged to the wild, and the wild, for reasons no one could explain, had claimed her in return. Dawn arrived, but it did not bring warmth. Instead, the world turned a softer, ghostly gray, the wind gentler but still bitingly cold. Sophie opened her eyes, feeling groggy and achy all over. For a moment she thought the night's events were only a dream, the storm, the crash, her mother's silence. But then she saw the bobcat curled beside her, its fur dusted with snow. Her heart jumped with both fear and amazement. The animal was still there. It blinked at her slowly, its big paws tucked under its chest. She shivered violently, the cold gnawing at her bones. The bobcat stretched and then, in a move that surprised Sophie, pressed its nose to her cheek and licked her face with a sandpaper rough tongue. The sensation was so startling and so oddly warm that she let out a weak laugh. The bobcat licked her again, this time moving up to her forehead, as if washing her like a kitten. Sophie giggled, feeling some part of her fear drain away. She tried to sit up, but her body felt heavy, every muscle stiff. Her boots were filled with snow, her mittens stiff and soaked. She whimpered, and the bobcat pressed its side against her, as if urging her to keep close. All around them, the forest was eerily quiet. The worst of the blizzard had passed, but the sky was still thick with clouds, and the cold was as sharp as broken glass. Sophie remembered her mom, her heart aching. She wanted to cry, to yell for help, but her voice was hoarse and barely more than a whisper. She looked at the bobcat. "Kitty, I want my mommy." The animal blinked and turned its head, ears pricking up as if it understood. Then, with a burst of feline energy, it rose, stretching every muscle, and slipped off into the trees. "No, don't leave." Sophie's voice was ragged, fear clutching her heart. But the bobcat disappeared between the trunks, silent as a shadow. Sophie pulled her knees up, hugging herself. The cold was returning fast, settling deeper into her bones. She tried to stay awake, not wanting to slip back into the strange, drifting dreams. Just when she thought she would start to cry, she heard a sound, a rustle, then the crunch of snow. The bobcat reappeared, something dangling from its mouth. Sophie's eyes widened. The animal carried a bird, small, limp, feathers ruffled from its hunt. It dropped the bird at Sophie's feet, then looked at her expectantly. Sophie stared, not sure what to do. She remembered her mom once telling her about wild animals, how they hunted to survive, how food was precious in the forest. She reached out with trembling hands, touching the bird's feathers. She felt too sick to eat, but the bobcat nudged her gently, then tore a piece of meat and ate it. It seemed to invite her to try. Her stomach cramped from hunger. She tried to nibble at the bird, gagging at first, but she forced herself to chew. The meat was strange and cold, but after the first few bites, she felt a little better. "Thank you, Kitty," she whispered, her voice weak but grateful. The bobcat licked its paws and settled down beside her again, sharing its body heat. The moment was strange and wild. Sophie, a lost child, finding her only comfort in the company of a wild predator. Far away, the storm was finally lifting. Sunlight struggled through the clouds, making the snow on the branches sparkle. In the distance, the faint sound of a snowmobile engine cut through the morning hush, but it was quickly swallowed by the forest. Search teams had expanded their search grid. Rescuers on foot and snowmobiles fanned out across the mountain pass, following every clue. They reached the site of the car crash and followed Sophie's tiny footprints into the trees, only to find, much to their confusion, a set of much larger tracks beside them. "Look at this," one searcher said, kneeling. "These aren't coyote tracks. They're cat. Bobcat, maybe. But they're side by side, with the kids." Another shook his head in disbelief. "You ever hear of a bobcat not attacking a child?" They marked the tracks, took photos, called for more help. Helicopters hovered when they could. Searchers shouted Sophie's name. But the woods swallowed every sound. Emily, recovering in a hospital bed with frostbitten hands, refused to rest. She pleaded with the rescuers, desperate for news. She would not, could not give up hope. In the woods, Sophie's world shrank to survival. She followed the bobcat as it led her deeper under the trees, away from the wind. They found a thicket where the snow was less deep, sheltered by low branches. The bobcat curled around her again, sharing warmth. Sophie watched as it cleaned its paws, occasionally glancing up at her with those wild, thoughtful eyes. As the day wore on, Sophie grew weaker but refused to let herself fall asleep. She talked to the bobcat in a faint voice, telling it stories about her mom, her home, her favorite cartoons. The bobcat listened, silent and patient, as if it understood every word. As evening fell, the cold returned sharper than before. Sophie felt her eyelids droop, her thoughts spinning. But the bobcat shifted, pressing closer, licking her cheek whenever she started to drift away. Out in the vast, wild snowfields, rescuers huddled together, studying the parallel tracks. A story written in the snow, proof of something none of them could yet explain. They pressed on, their hope as fragile as the footprints vanishing behind them. Sophie held tight to her only friend in the world, trusting in the warmth and wildness that had saved her once and might save her again. By the time the second night began to fall, the storm had spent most of its fury. The world grew eerily still, the woods wrapped in a heavy hush, as if nature itself was holding its breath. But for Sophie, every second crawled by with slow agony. She was shivering harder now, her lips blue, hands stiff and clumsy. Hunger gnawed at her belly, and even the smallest movements hurt. If it weren't for the bobcat, she might have given up. But the animal stayed by her side, watchful and alert, its green eyes always trained on her or scanning the shadows for danger. Sophie followed the bobcat deeper into the forest, her feet dragging, her thoughts cloudy and slow. Every so often the animal would pause, turning back to nudge her forward or brush its head against her knee, coaxing her to keep moving. "Come on, kitty," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Let's find somewhere warm." They stumbled upon a hollow tree, its trunk twisted and open near the roots. A perfect hiding place. The bobcat ducked inside, then looked back, as if inviting her to follow. Sophie hesitated only a moment, then crawled in after her wild companion. Inside, it was dark but sheltered. The snow piled high around the base, muffling the wind and blocking out much of the cold. The bobcat turned in a slow circle, then curled up against the far wall, leaving just enough room for Sophie to press in beside it. She snuggled close, grateful for its warmth, its fur soft beneath her trembling fingers. The animal's body heat felt like a miracle, the only thing keeping her from freezing solid. She listened to its slow breathing, let herself imagine it was a big, wild version of the cats she'd seen in storybooks. Only this one was real, alive, and her only friend in the world. Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentler this time, the storm's edge moving on. But inside the tree, the air was thick with hope and fear. Sophie tried to stay awake, but her exhaustion was overwhelming. Her eyelids fluttered. The bobcat, sensing her weakness, licked her face, the rough tongue dragging her back from the edge of unconsciousness. For hours, Sophie drifted in and out of sleep. She dreamed of her mom's arms, of sunlight pouring through the kitchen window, of her teddy bear waiting for her at home. Each time she stirred, the bobcat was there, watching her with steady eyes. Sometimes it would get up, stretch, slip out into the woods, and return with another small animal or a mouthful of snow for her to suck on. She ate little, but every bite kept her alive. Meanwhile, out in the snow-covered hills, the search intensified. The weather was clearing, and teams moved with fresh urgency. The tracks had grown stranger, the little girl's prints alongside those of a wild cat, weaving through the trees together, then vanishing and reappearing farther on. Radio chatter filled the cold air. "We've got the girl's footprints again, and the cat. I don't believe it, but they're together. Not a single sign of struggle. What's going on out there?" Helicopters buzzed overhead when they could, their spotlights cutting through the trees, while teams on snowshoes and snowmobiles probed every hollow and drift. Emily, still in the hospital, refused to rest. She called every hour, begging for updates. "Don't stop looking," she pleaded, her voice raw from crying. "She's out there. I know she is. Please." Night fell once more, and inside the hollow tree, Sophie and the bobcat huddled together for warmth. Sophie felt herself slipping away, her mind foggy, her body too cold to shiver. The animal pressed against her, its breath tickling her cheek, its purr, a low, vibrating rumble in its chest, filling the darkness with the strangest kind of comfort. Suddenly, the bobcat's ears twitched. It lifted its head, sniffing the air. Sophie barely registered the change, but the animal was alert, body tensed as if sensing danger, or maybe hope. Outside, a distant voice echoed through the trees, shouts, footsteps crunching on snow. "Over here! I see something! Wait! Look! Those are tracks!" Light spilled into the hollow, blinding after so much darkness. A man's voice called out, "My God! She's here! And what in the—" In the beam of a flashlight, searchers saw a sight none of them would ever forget. Sophie, nearly frozen, curled up in the embrace of a massive bobcat. The animal rose, hackles bristling, but it didn't attack. Instead, it stared at the rescuers with unblinking calm, as if daring them to come closer. A rescuer knelt down, hands trembling. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. We're here to help you." Sophie barely had the strength to look up. She tried to speak, but her words stuck in her throat. "Kitty," she managed, reaching a weak hand toward the bobcat's fur. The rescuers stared in disbelief as the bobcat gently licked Sophie's cheek one last time. Then, in one smooth motion, it slipped out of the hollow tree and melted into the snowy woods, gone as silently as it had appeared. The rescuers gathered Sophie in blankets, rushing her to safety. They would never forget the sight. A wild animal and a child, surviving the impossible together. As they carried Sophie out of the forest, she looked back once, searching for her unlikely protector. But the woods were empty now, the tracks already filling with new falling snow. The miracle had happened, and no one could explain it. But Sophie and the wild bobcat had survived. The rescue team moved fast, their boots crunching in the fresh snow as they hurried Sophie through the trees. Warm blankets wrapped around her small, frozen body, hands gentle but hurried, faces etched with disbelief and awe. All the way back to the road, Sophie kept glancing over her shoulder, searching for a flash of pale fur or the gleam of wild green eyes. But the forest had swallowed her guardian. Just trees, snow, and wind, as if the bobcat had never been there at all. When they reached the waiting ambulance, the paramedics worked quickly, checking Sophie's vital signs, wrapping her in heated blankets, and speaking in soothing voices. "You're safe now, sweetheart. You're going to be okay. We've got you." But even in the flurry of activity, IVs, warm fluids, hushed conversations, Sophie kept asking the same question. "Where's Kitty? Did you see my kitty?" None of the adults could answer. The paramedics looked at one another, confusion flickering in their eyes. One of the searchers, still shaking, murmured, "I saw it with my own eyes. That cat was protecting her, like she was one of its own cubs." The ambulance raced through the snow-choked roads to the nearest hospital. Inside, Sophie drifted in and out of sleep, always reaching for the bobcat that was no longer there. Each time she woke, she searched the room, expecting to see a striped tail or hear a soft purr. Instead, she found her mother. Emily rushed into Sophie's hospital room, arms trembling, voice shaking. She gathered her daughter up, ignoring the IV lines, the wires, the warnings. She held Sophie tight, sobbing against her tangled hair. "I thought I'd lost you, baby. I thought I'd lost you forever." Sophie snuggled close, still shivering, still impossibly small in Emily's arms. "Mommy, Kitty saved me," she whispered. "He was big and soft and warm, and he licked my cheek when I was cold." Emily squeezed her tighter, unable to believe, unable to let go. She whispered thank yous, to God, to fate, to whatever wild mercy had kept her daughter alive. Doctors hovered nearby, shaking their heads in disbelief as they read Sophie's chart. She was dangerously cold, her fingers and toes white and stiff, lips blue with frostbite. But against every prediction, she'd survived. No major injuries, no lost limbs, no sign of animal attack. If anything, the strange warmth of the bobcat's fur had been the difference between life and death. As news of Sophie's rescue spread, reporters gathered outside the hospital, cameras pointed at every door. The story was too incredible, too wild, too perfect for a hungry world. "Lost child saved by wild bobcat," blared the headlines. "Miracle in the Wyoming snow." Inside, Emily stayed close by Sophie's bed, never letting go of her hand. She watched her daughter sleep, wondering about the wild animal that had chosen not to harm but to help. The questions circled through her mind. Had Sophie really been protected by a wild bobcat? Or was it just a child's dream? But then she remembered the tracks in the snow, the disbelief on the faces of the rescuers, and she let herself believe in miracles, just this once. In the following days, wildlife experts and scientists poured into Wyoming, eager to examine the evidence. They combed the site where Sophie had been found, studying the parallel tracks, tiny boot prints side by side with the unmistakable marks of a large cat. They found tufts of fur, samples of frozen droppings, even a single bloodstain from one of the bobcat's kills. But none of it made sense. Bobcats were solitary, territorial, fiercely wild. They did not tolerate humans, let alone rescue their young. "This is unprecedented," said Dr. Carter Feldman, a wildlife biologist, his voice crackling through the evening news. "There are no verified cases, none, of a bobcat acting this way. We have to assume extreme hunger, or a case of mistaken identity, or even coincidence." But no one could explain away the most basic truth. Sophie was alive, and she owed her survival to something wild and unexplainable. Back at the hospital, Sophie drew pictures with crayons. Her mother, herself, and a great big cat with pale stripes and shining eyes. She showed them to every nurse and doctor, telling her story over and over. Most of them nodded and smiled, gentle but doubtful. But some, like the searcher who'd found her, believed. "I saw it," he insisted, voice low and certain. "That cat was her guardian. You can't tell me different." For Emily, the miracle was both a blessing and a source of new nightmares. She woke in the night, clutching Sophie, haunted by the memory of her daughter alone in the storm. She asked herself 1,000 questions. What if the bobcat hadn't come? What if she'd never been found? Was there a purpose behind it all? Or was it only chance? Sophie's story made its way across America. Social media lit up with hashtags: Bobcat Miracle, Guardian of the Wild. News anchors debated the truth. Scientists argued on talk shows, and people everywhere sent letters, prayers, and stuffed animals to the hospital. Through it all, Emily stayed by Sophie's side, grateful for every moment, humbled by what she could never explain. At night, when Sophie whispered, "Do you think Kitty is lonely now, Mommy?" Emily brushed her hair and whispered back, "I think Kitty knows he did something special, sweetheart. I think he'll never forget you." And in the deepest corners of her own heart, Emily clung to the mystery, the wild grace that had saved her daughter, the miracle that had found them in the heart of a Wyoming blizzard. The storm was long gone, but its echo lingered, on the slopes of South Pass, in the halls of the hospital, and deep inside the hearts of everyone who'd witnessed Sophie's impossible survival. With Sophie safe and slowly recovering, a different kind of storm took hold. A tempest of questions, theories, and debates that swept through the town, the state, and soon the whole country. In the days after her rescue, scientists and reporters descended on the region. Wildlife experts held interviews and late-night discussions, their voices layered with both awe and skepticism. At the center of every conversation was the same question: why had the Bobcat acted as it did? Was it desperation, instinct, or something beyond the wildest logic of nature? Dr. Carter Feldman, the wildlife biologist now almost as famous as Sophie, faced a sea of microphones. "Bobcats are solitary, territorial animals," he explained, speaking with authority but not certainty. "They do not nurture the young of other species. They are predators, not protectors. This event, it goes against everything we know." A younger researcher, Dr. Lane, countered, "We have documented rare cases where wild animals display compassion. Wolves fostering lost pups, dolphins helping humans. Maybe this bobcat sensed Sophie's innocence. Or maybe in the heart of that blizzard, the instinct for life was stronger than the instinct for the hunt." Some believed the bobcat had been starving, and that by chance, Sophie's presence had been less threatening than expected. Others argued the animal had been injured or confused, its behavior a fluke, never to be repeated. But then there were those who saw something more, something that defied simple explanation. A park ranger, grizzled and gray, shook his head when a reporter pressed him for answers. "Sometimes," he said, "the wild is bigger than us, bigger than reason. You see things out here. A coyote helping a lost calf, a deer standing watch over a newborn lamb. Maybe the bobcat was just trying to survive. Or maybe it saw a little girl freezing and lost, and something in it changed." Emily listened to every theory, every debate. She watched the news with Sophie curled in her lap, her daughter's hair still tangled, her cheeks still too pale. None of the experts' answers felt complete. She remembered the way Sophie had whispered about the bobcat, how it had licked her face, kept her warm, and never left her side. She remembered the gentle but fierce green eyes the searchers described, and the way Sophie had survived against all odds. One night, as the snow fell quietly outside the hospital window, Emily sat beside Sophie, holding her hand. "Do you remember everything, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Sophie nodded. "He wasn't mean, Mommy. He was nice. He was cold, too. He was just lonely, I think. He wanted a friend." Emily brushed a curl from Sophie's forehead. "Maybe he needed you as much as you needed him." As the world speculated and argued, Emily began to feel something shift inside her. The terror of those hours in the blizzard softened, replaced by a strange, humble gratitude. She didn't need to know exactly why the bobcat had helped Sophie. She only knew that, for reasons beyond science or logic, kindness and wildness had touched in that frozen wilderness. But not everyone was content to let the mystery lie. Across America, the story sparked deep, sometimes heated conversations. Talk show hosts debated whether wildness and compassion could truly coexist. Some questioned whether the event had even happened as reported, demanding more proof, more logic, more evidence. Others clung to the story as a sign of hope in a world that so often felt harsh and unpredictable. At school, children drew pictures of Sophie and her kitty, some with hearts around them, others with stars. People wrote letters, emails, and online posts, sharing their own stories of unexpected help, animal rescues, or moments of grace in dark times. The story became a touchstone, a way for people to share their belief in goodness, even where it was least expected. For Emily, the meaning grew quieter, more personal. Late at night, with Sophie finally asleep and the world hushed, she wrote in her journal, "I will never understand what happened out there. Not fully. I could search for answers for the rest of my life and never find the real one." Maybe that's okay. Maybe what matters is that Sophie was seen, not just by us, but by something wild and ancient. Maybe the wild has its own kind of mercy. Back at the hospital, Sophie grew stronger by the day. She spoke less about the cold now, and more about her friend. She wished she could see the Bobcat again, worried he was cold or hungry or lonely in the woods. "Do you think he remembers me, Mommy?" she asked one morning, her eyes wide and searching. Emily smiled, her heart aching with love. "I think he'll always remember you, sweetheart." Some friends never really leave, and for the first time since the blizzard, Emily felt something like peace. Not certainty, not closure, but acceptance. She chose to believe that, for one frozen night, something wild and gentle had bridged the gap between fear and kindness, between life and death. She believed in a moment where survival instincts became something more, a bridge between two living souls in the wilderness. As spring crept slowly back over the Wyoming mountains and the snow began to melt, the questions remained. But so did the story, Sophie's story, the Bobcat's story, the story of a miracle that no one could ever truly explain. In the weeks that followed Sophie's return, the world gradually moved on. The headlines faded, replaced by newer, louder stories. Yet for the Carter family, and for everyone who had followed the Wyoming miracle, the questions lingered, echoing in quiet moments and sleepless nights. As Sophie's wounds healed, life at home took on a new, quieter rhythm. Emily would often pause at the window in the early mornings, mug of coffee in hand, watching the snow recede from the fields. Sometimes she would catch herself scanning the tree line for movement, a flicker of pale fur, the glint of green eyes, but the wild had returned to its secrets. The bobcat, if he was out there, was just a rumor in the wind. Still, the memory refused to fade. Sophie, now attending preschool again, carried the story inside her like a small, flickering light. She would tell it to her friends, to teachers, to anyone who would listen. "We were both cold," she would say, earnest and serious. "But Kitty was braver than me. He kept me warm so I could come home." Other children would ask, "Weren't you scared?" Sophie always paused, thoughtful. "I was scared, but he was scared too. Maybe we made each other not so scared." At night, Emily would tuck her daughter into bed, smoothing her hair and kissing her cheeks, and listen as Sophie whispered a soft "good night" toward the darkened window, just in case her wild friend was listening. Sometimes Emily would join in, both of them sending out a silent thank you to the deep, wild unknown. The news programs eventually shifted their focus, but not before launching a national conversation about the wild, about childhood, and about the unexplainable. People called in to share their own encounters with the unexpected kindness of nature, stray dogs that led lost hikers to safety, deer that guarded injured travelers, birds that sat with children in storms. One night, a radio host summed up what many felt. "Maybe the wild isn't just a place of danger," she said, her voice gentle and full of wonder. "Maybe it's also a place of grace. Sometimes, when we need it most, the world sends us help in the most unlikely forms." In the weeks that followed, psychologists and child experts debated on TV panels. Some argued that Sophie's memory was shaped by trauma, that the mind invents guardians to make sense of terror. Others insisted the evidence was clear: tracks in the snow, witness accounts, the physical warmth that saved a little girl's life. But the story took on a life of its own, echoing in schools, in churches, around kitchen tables across America. For every skeptic, there were a dozen who saw something more: a lesson about survival, about connection, about trusting what we can't always explain. Emily herself became an unexpected advocate for that lesson. She began speaking to groups: school children, rescue workers, hospital volunteers, telling the story, not to explain it away, but to remind people of hope. "When the storm is at its worst," she would say, "sometimes you find friendship in the wildest places. Sometimes you have to trust in what you can't see, in what you can't control. And sometimes, help comes from where you least expect it." She watched as people nodded, their faces brightening with recognition. For many, the story was more than survival. It was about believing in grace, in the power of connection, in the mysteries that knit together all living things. Sophie's miracle also changed how Emily viewed the world. She found herself slowing down, listening more. To her daughter, to the wind, to the subtle signs of life all around. She paid closer attention to the small acts of kindness, the way a neighbor shoveled their walk, the laughter of children playing in fresh snow, the gentle nuzzle of a barn cat against Sophie's cheek. The story followed them everywhere. At the grocery store, people would whisper, "That's her, the little girl who was saved by the Bobcat." At church, strangers offered quiet prayers of thanks. Some sent letters, hundreds of them, sharing stories of loss and hope, struggle and rescue. "My own son was saved by a stray dog," one woman wrote. "After my husband died, a wild bird sang at my window every morning," said another. Each story felt like another thread woven into the larger fabric, a reminder that the wild, like childhood, is unpredictable. Sometimes it is cruel and unforgiving, but sometimes, in the harshest moments, it shows a gentleness that defies explanation. Sophie, still so young, understood in a way that adults often forgot. "I think Kitty was lonely," she told her mom one evening as they watched the snow fall outside. Emily squeezed her hand. "Maybe we all are sometimes. Maybe we all need a friend, even if we're wild." One afternoon, as the first hints of spring thawed the fields and the last of the snow melted away, Emily and Sophie took a walk together. They passed the edge of the woods, the place where Sophie's tracks and the Bobcats had last been seen. Sophie stopped, peering into the shadows. "Do you think he's still out there?" Emily knelt beside her. "I hope so. And if he is, I hope he knows you're okay." Sophie reached into her pocket, pulling out a tiny toy cat she'd carried since her return. She set it on a log at the forest's edge. "In case he gets lonely," she whispered. They stood together for a while, letting the wind move around them, the world quiet and vast. In that silence, Emily found a peace she hadn't known before, a certainty that some things could never be explained, but that didn't mean they weren't real. The miracle of the Bobcat had become more than a headline. It was a story about survival, but also about trust, about connection, about the wild possibility of grace. And in that, Emily found hope, not just for her daughter, but for everyone who listened, who remembered, who dared to believe. Years passed, as they always do, but the memory of the blizzard and the bobcat lingered, etched deep in Sophie's heart and woven through the fabric of her family's life. As Sophie grew older, she never forgot those 36 hours in the snow, the cold, the fear, and the wild warmth that had kept her alive when nothing else could. Now she sometimes found herself sharing the story. It might be at school, sitting with friends on the playground, or at a sleepover as the lights dimmed and the room grew quiet. Sometimes it was at community events, when her mother was invited to speak and Sophie stood by her side, shy but proud. And always, the story began the same way. It was the worst blizzard Wyoming had seen in 20 years. People listened, some with tears, some with skeptical smiles. There were always questions. How did it feel? Were you scared? Do you really believe it happened just like that? And Sophie answered each one as honestly as she could. I was scared, she'd say. But Kitty wasn't. Or maybe he was, but he stayed with me anyway. Her mother would add her own perspective. The heartache and helplessness of waking up in a silent car. The long wait for news. The miracle of seeing Sophie again. I will never forget how small she looked in that hospital bed, Emily would say, voice thick with emotion. And how she kept talking about her friend with the green eyes. I choose to believe it was real, every bit of it. As Sophie matured, the story changed shape, growing with her. In her teenage years, she sometimes doubted her own memory. Had she imagined it all? Had the cold and fear conjured a dream she'd carried ever since? But then she'd recall the warmth, the scratch of a rough tongue on her cheek, the steady heartbeat beneath her ear. She'd remember the parallel tracks in the snow, the disbelief in the voices of grown men who'd seen the wild cat with their own eyes. Even if no one could explain it, even if it was never written in any scientific journal, Sophie knew what she had lived. At home, Sophie's room was filled with reminders. Children's drawings of her and Kitty, newspaper clippings, the tiny toy cat she'd left at the forest's edge long ago. Each one was a thread in a tapestry of hope and wonder, a reminder that sometimes the world gave us grace where we least expected it. For Emily, the story was never about proving anything to anyone. It became a message she shared with gentle conviction, at schools, libraries, community halls, and wherever people needed to be reminded of the power of hope. To me, this isn't just a story about a lost child and a wild bobcat, she'd say, her eyes shining as she looked at Sophie in the audience. It's proof that even in the coldest, loneliest nights, help can come from where we least expect it. She would pause, scanning the faces in the crowd, her voice soft but strong. If you've ever found comfort or rescue from an unlikely source, or believe in the kindness of nature, I hope you'll share your thoughts or pass this story to someone who needs hope. Sometimes, the wildest friendships are the ones that save us. As Sophie grew into adulthood, she became an advocate for wildlife, inspired by her own improbable savior. She volunteered with local animal rescue groups and spoke up for conservation. Her story a reminder that every creature, no matter how wild, has a place in the world. And sometimes, that place is right at our side when we need it most. Mother and daughter shared a bond deepened by their ordeal, strengthened every time they revisited that winter, every time they walked together in the woods and remembered. They never saw the bobcat again, but sometimes, on crisp mornings when the mist hung low and the world was still, they would spot tracks along the tree line, and they would smile, believing that their friend was out there, living wild and free. Years after the blizzard, Sophie stood beneath the same pine trees where she'd once been so small, so lost. She was taller now, surer of herself, but she knelt to place a fresh bouquet of wildflowers on the log where she'd once left a toy cat. "Thank you," she whispered, her words carried by the wind into the quiet, endless woods. "You saved me. I'll never forget you." Back at home, Emily finished writing a letter for the local paper, sharing their story once more. She ended with the words that had become their family's quiet anthem. "In the wildest storms, when hope feels lost and help seems impossible, look for grace in unexpected places. Trust in connection, trust in kindness, trust in the wild and wondrous ways the world can save us." As the years rolled by, Sophie and Emily's story became a local legend, retold at campfires and classrooms, inspiring new generations to believe in both the strength and the gentleness of the wild. It was not just a tale of survival, but a celebration of trust, resilience, and the quiet, miraculous bridges that can form between the most unlikely companions. So if you ever find yourself lost, in a storm, in life, or in doubt, remember Sophie and her wild friend. Remember that sometimes salvation wears whiskers and stripes. Remember to share your story, to reach out to others, and to believe in miracles, even when the world tells you they're impossible. Thank you for listening to our story. If it's given you hope or made you remember a moment when you were saved by kindness, human or wild, please share it or simply pass it on. Because sometimes, the wildest friendships truly are the ones that save us.